Everyone, welcome to the April 23rd edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host, Craig Milkowski. Craig, back with me. Unfortunately, missed you last week, Craig. I know you were a little under the weather, so we didn't get to do our first Pacecast with video a week ago, but happy to debut it this week. And when we've added video to these podcasts, Craig, I know that adding it to the forecast has helped us show some of the things we're looking at in past performances, how to handicap, showing some replays, different stats and formulator. But I'm actually really excited to do the TimeformUS Pacecast with video because on this podcast, we talk about a lot of things that we're seeing on our screen in the TimeformUS charts, giving out speed figures. We try to remember to say the speed figures for every race. But now that we're doing video with the TimeformUS Pacecast, we'll be able to show you the charts that we're looking at and hopefully some replays along the way as well.
Yeah, it's definitely, hopefully will give the viewer a better experience. It will still be listenable if you're just doing it audio version wise. But yeah, I'm looking forward to this because I do get forgetful. I get excited about these races sometimes and forget the actual number.
And we've got some interesting races to look back at from this past week. Obviously, it's a little bit of a lull in the calendar in terms of Grade 1 action before we get some major cards coming up with Triple Crown season starting. They're drawing the Kentucky Derby in, 4 days? We're recording this on Tuesday. I think they're drawing the Kentucky Derby on Saturday evening this year, so earlier than ever before. So we're going to have those PPs quite early, and Craig and I are planning some content that we'll be putting out around the Kentucky Derby early next week. But as far as this week goes, the past weekend, plenty of action at Keeneland as they are towards the tail end of their spring meet. We'll talk about plenty of graded stakes action from there, as well as some allowance and maiden races that earned some notable speed figures from last week. The major race at Oaklawn Park was the Oaklawn Handicap. That's actually where we're going to start the podcast. That was really the only major race from Oaklawn this past week. And then we'll finish things up on this podcast by discussing some stakes action when they got back on the turf for the first time in New York so far this year at Aqueduct, the Dangerous Hour, and the Plenty of Grace, the feature from the Saturday and Sunday cards there last weekend. And then we'll close things out with a couple races from Santa Anita and Laurel, the Grade 3 Californian, that top race in Southern California from this past weekend. And then they ran some stakes races last Saturday at Laurel. We'll talk about two of them at the end of this podcast. But Craig, we're going to kick things off, like I said, with that Oaklawn Handicap Grade 2 event from Saturday. And I am going to share my screen for those watching along with us on YouTube. Like Craig said, the audio version of this, of course, still available. Some of you might be listening to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. But if you're watching on YouTube, hopefully you can see the TimeformUS chart for the Oaklawn Handicap, this Grade 2 event, going the 1 1/8 distance, Craig. And Skippy Longstocking got the job done here as the 5-2 favorite. This is a horse who I think we were wondering what we were going to get from him after he was eased in the Pegasus World Cup going back to January. Returned to form in the Challenger, though not beating the toughest field that day. But I think he dispelled any notions that he was a finished product when he got back on track here by winning this Oaklawn Handicap quite decisively against a nice field.
Yeah, this was a very good race for him. He's a horse who's kind of been on the fringes of being a top horse all along, but he really delivered here with a big 125 TimeformUS speed figure. And if you're watching this, you'll note the C in the chart for conditions. And that is because this is a race I actually broke out from the other routes, and particularly the other 9 furlong race. And it just made a lot of sense to do it this way. Otherwise, this race would have been even faster, and a bunch of horses in here would have been running big lifetime tops. It was a card where there were 4 different track conditions throughout, from wet fast to good, to muddy to fast. So I didn't really have a problem breaking it out. This is basically just based on the horses in this race. But it just made a much better figure, I think, than had I just grouped everything together.
Yeah, that's the when these past performances show up, or the running lines show up in the horse's past performances for their next start, and you're using the TimeformUS PPs, you can click on that speed figure. It'll bring up the explanation that Craig just gave of what that C does mean if you're wondering about that in the future and you don't remember from us discussing it on this podcast. I'll pull up the replay of this Oaklawn Handicap just to take a look at Skippy Longstocking strutting his stuff. Craig overcame an outside post position in here. I thought it was interesting that there was another Safi Joseph train in here, the long shot got number 9 drawn right inside of Skippy Longstocking in post 10. And it was almost like he was sort of using that horse as a pace setter for Skippy Longstocking, made sure to clear to the front end, getting in front of Octane, who I think was maybe the other horse that could have shown speed in here. And it just allowed Skippy Longstocking to get this perfect stalking trip right off another horse. That's how we've seen him have the most success in the past. He's not a horse that really wants to be off the bridle early chasing a fast pace. I think we saw that in the Pegasus World Cup. He wasn't really comfortable getting that kind of trip. But when we're going a moderate set of fractions up front, that he can get this trip, just comfortable stalking, that's what he's at his best. And a couple of his main rivals in here just had to come from further back in the pack. I thought the number 1 Highland Falls ran pretty well. He's still a lightly raced Brad Cox horse. This was just the 6th start of his career, but he advanced nicely through the pack, finished up this race strongly. And then the number 5 Red Route 1, who was coming from as far back as he always does. He's just always going to be at the mercy of the pace. He got the right pace setup when he caused that minor upset 2 back at Fairgrounds, and just not as favorable a pace setup here.
Yeah, I mean, the pace figures show the pace was pretty solid. It wasn't fast by any means, but it's not like it was dawdling. And I just think Skippy Longstocking was the best horse. He did get a good trip thanks to his stablemate. But, I think he's a horse who probably doesn't like to be on the lead. One thing I noticed as I was perusing the PPs is he actually seems like a horse, maybe as he's getting better with age, that really appreciates the 1 1/8. And I wonder if this horse couldn't even go further. He's a horse that's running the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile and ran fine, but I actually think he's better at these longer distances. And given the way the older horse division is shaping up, I don't see any reason he couldn't be a player if he keeps running this well.
Yeah, I mean, there really aren't that many opportunities or necessities to go 10 furlongs when you're an older horse, unless you're pointing to the Breeders' Cup Classic. And based on this kind of effort and the speed figure that he earned, makes sense that the connections would be thinking that way at this early point in the year. We'll see how the rest of it goes. Sometimes Skippy Longstocking is the kind of horse that can win these grade 2 or grade 3 events and finds himself just a cut below at the grade 1 level. I think this was his 6th graded stakes victory, and they were all either grade 2 or grade 3 races. But this was a deeper field than we've seen him beat on some other occasions when he stepped up into races like this, Craig. So maybe it does give some hope that he might be able to continue winning at the higher levels moving forward. The only other horse maybe we should mention from this race is Reincarnate, who just is one of those horses that seems to continually underperform. You expect more from these Bob Baffert trainees. He's run some big speed figures on occasion, but he just doesn't seem to really factor in the big dances.
No, he was a non-factor. I mean, he ran fine, really, but was never competitive and just seems like a cut below even this grade 2 level.
Well, let's move on over to Keeneland, and we're going to discuss one of their feature races from that Saturday card in the same division as the Oaklawn Handicap, the Grade 3 Ben Ali, this one going 1 3/16, so a little longer than the Oaklawn race. Grade 3 event for these older horses, Craig, and I think you had to like the step forward that we saw from the 4-year-old Kingsbarns in just the second start of his season. He obviously went to the sidelines halfway through his 3-year-old year. Maybe the Derby took its toll on a horse who was fairly lightly raced going into the first Saturday in May last year, made 1 start after that, then took the rest of the year off. Didn't learn too much about him when he came off the layoff at Gulfstream, just 1 going 7 furlongs, but stretched all the way out to the 1 3/16 here. And the added distance definitely seemed to agree with this horse.
Yeah, speaking of horses who can make some noise in the older horse division, I mean, this one certainly thrust his name right up there near the top of the list, running a big 124 TimeformUS speed figure. Did it really impressively. I know in his return, he had come back at 7 furlongs and his speed figure wasn't much, but we had kind of cautioned, I think, on the Pacecast that day that it really wasn't representative of his ability. We weren't going to hold that number against him. And boy, did he deliver here. And this one's pretty exciting to me. I look forward to seeing what he can do. Obviously, distance isn't going to be an issue with him. He has good tactical speed. So he just seems like he's going to be a very dangerous horse anywhere he shows up if he can stay healthy.
Yeah, Craig, I had sort of forgotten until I was handicapping this race that he was actually one of the pace setters in the 2023 Kentucky Derby. And you remember that was a race that completely fell apart, featured a very fast pace. Mage came from far back in the pack. And I didn't think Kingsbarns was the horse that had that kind of speed going into the Derby. And it seems like Todd Pletcher and the connections have definitely changed the game plan with him since then. He showed that new dimension coming from as far off the pace as he did to win that 7 furlong allowance race. And there didn't appear to be that much speed in this Ben Ali on paper. I had Marcus Hirsch on the forecast last week, and we were sort of talking about how Laughing Boy, who is shown on the lead in this replay that we're taking a look at, was going to have likely an uncontested lead unless they were aggressive with Kingsbarns, and they were not. Luis Saez, who typically is an aggressive rider, took him back early, was content to sit in about fourth place through the early stages of this race, and he got to pumping on him here coming around the far turn, had to ask him to go, but once Kingsbarns gets into gear, he's able to sustain that stride, and he definitely does give off the vibe that he is that mile and a quarter horse who wants to go these longer distances. I thought the runner-up in this race, War Campaign, ran fine. He's very consistent from a TimeformUS speed figure standpoint. He's probably just a cut below the best in this division.
Yeah, this wasn't the strongest field. I mean, War Campaign is not a top older horse, but it just said he's consistent. He generally runs right around that high teens or 120 type speed figure. So I think the 124 Kingsbarn ran here is very legitimate, and I wouldn't be surprised if he takes a step forward go next time we see him.
Yeah, this was a strong effort. Craig, looking through the speed figures for this day at Keeneland, Keeneland hasn't been the easiest meet to make speed figures for. I know there have been some track biases that have been talked about. Also, plenty of turf racing intermingled with the dirt racing. Sometimes it seems like the routes play a little differently than the sprints. I think Beyer might have made a different decision about this race than you did and had it a lot slower. But I kind of agree that the number makes sense. The 124 for Kingsbarns, I know it's a big step up for him, but it fits with everybody else in this race. And War Campaign, like I said, has been such a consistent horse. It felt like he ran his race this day. So the 121 TimeformUS speed figure, it's right in line. And you can see that in the TimeformUS chart showing his prior figs. The disappointments in this race, obviously, were horses like Dynamic One and Smile Happy, horses that had shown plenty of class in the past couple of seasons, but just have not been in the best form lately. And I'll be kind of surprised if we ever see Smile Happy on the racetrack again.
No, I think he was a first-time gelding, wasn't he, if I remember right?
He was.
And it just didn't seem to do the trick for him. And he was a good horse in his time, but seems like maybe his issues have gotten the best of him, mostly mental. He just had some real problems with the starting gate. So I doubt we'll see him again as well. I would hope not, honestly.
Well, let's discuss the other graded stakes on this Saturday card at Keeneland. It was the Grade 2 Elkhorn, this one going the 1.5 mile distance on the turf. And a Charlie Appleby Godolphin runner winning this race, but not the one that most people expected, as the heavy favorite Bold Act, who was set postward at 2-5, did go down to defeat here to his unheralded stablemate Silver Knot, a horse that we had seen compete in some of the top races for 3-year-olds last year, not necessarily winning, but picking up checks in many of them. Came back to the U.S. this year. Obviously, Charlie Appleby views this as a horse that is well suited to American racing. Had never gone this far before. 1.5 miles was a real test of stamina for him, but I know Charlie Appleby seemed to have some confidence he would handle it based on pedigree. And when you look at his dam side pedigree, he's certainly bred to go this far, even though his prior races might not have suggested he was crying out for more distance. And he definitely handled it, Craig, though there was certainly a difference in trips between these two Godolphin runners.
Yes, there was. I would imagine this is one that we're going to want to look at. But Silver Knot certainly handled the stretch out, running a big 125 TimeformUS speed figure, which is a very nice effort. And I would be surprised if he doesn't stay at these longer distances, because he's one of the few Charlie Appleby horses who had yet to have success in North America, despite repeated tries. I mean, he always seemed to show up and run a good race. But this just seemed like a better effort from him. Now, yeah, maybe he got a little bit lucky, as I'll let you talk a bit about the Bold Act and the trip that he had, but I still think he ran very well.
Yeah, and you could see, I'm showing the replay right now. The number 4 is Bold Act, who is the heavy favorite and eventual third-place finisher in this race, and you could see he is just throwing his head about. I thought Frankie Dettori had him in the right spot, saving ground right towards the middle of the pack. This horse is not a front runner. This is where he was always going to be placed. He just wants to go a quicker pace than we're going up front. And maybe it was coming off a little bit of a layoff, although he had a prep for this race in Dubai. But he just was way too keen. And I don't remember seeing this from him when he won the Sycamore at Keeneland last fall. He's just fighting the rider for really the first 4 or 5 furlongs of this race. And when you're going a marathon distance like this, Craig, and you want to produce that finishing kick in the stretch, you can't fight the rider for half of the race and then expect to produce that finish. I saw a lot of blame being thrown at Frankie Dettori for this ride. I didn't think it was his fault. It just seemed like the horse was not cooperating on the day.
Yeah, that's exactly how I viewed it. I mean, he put the horse in a great position. The horse just didn't seem to care for it very much. And once he was there, I don't know there was a whole lot he could do. And we're actually looking when he gets a little clear. And you can just see how eager he is to move up into that space when he finally gets it. And it's probably a bit premature at that point. And things just don't work out for him. But I'm with you. I think it was more horse than rider in this case for whatever reason. He was just way too keen. And I'll be interesting to hear what the trainer thinks and maybe if he's going to make any changes next time we see him.
Yeah, and it can be difficult to maneuver a horse like this when he's tugging at you and trying to go through those holes and place him in the right spot as he's advancing through traffic. You don't want the horse to do too much and run up on heels. So he tried to make that early move to at least get him into better position. But you can see here, he gets him out into the clear with plenty of time at the top of the stretch. It's a long stretch at Keeneland. The horse just fails to produce the same kick that we saw from him in the Sycamore last year. And it's easy to see why when you watch the opening furlongs at this race. And he's just not, he's just resenting that restraint. Silver Knot, he's just a much easier horse to ride. Flavien Prat did what he was supposed to do, put him in a forward position. And, Craig, I think we've seen over the last couple of weeks at Keeneland, when a trainer has multiple horses in races like this with different running styles, the forwardly placed one sometimes can get a little bit overlooked, not have the pressure applied, and be the one that gets the better trip. We definitely saw that with But Cachet when she upset the Jenny Wiley a couple of weeks ago. And it's a similar situation here, albeit not as quite a big of a price with Silver Knot, but the stablemate who looked a little inferior on paper comes out on top, just getting the better trip. Missed the cut, the horse coming in from Southern California. He ran fine, and I think at least validated the form from out there. I think some of the races he was exiting on that circuit didn't look like the deepest or the strongest, but he ran well, just probably not quite as good as either of these Charlie Appleby runners, even though he finished ahead of one of them.
Yeah, I was happy to see how well he ran because it kind of validates. We like to see that our speed figures will ship, and it did in his case. And yeah, he ran a good, strong second. So I imagine he'll show up in California again and kind of beat up on the competition. But he at least showed he is competitive in the bigger races.
We're going to stick with Keeneland and move over to their Friday card. The feature race that day was the Grade 3 Double Dog Dare. This one going the 1.16 distance for the fillies and mares at the Grade 3 level. And, Craig, I'm going to redboard a little bit on this one. I thought 5-2 was a pretty generous price on Raging Sea when I look up the PPs for this race. I mean, they just went wild for Scylla, who was the horse with upside, and she's got that big pedigree. I think a lot of people expecting her to turn out to be a graded stakes type of horse, but she was the kind of runner that needed to take a step forward to beat this field, and I think the public just assumed she was going to do so. She ran her typical number, and Raging Sea, who seemed like she was really on the upswing towards the end of her 3-year-old season, winning that comely stakes at Aqueduct against a solid field, probably without much surprise, took another step forward in her 4-year-old debut.
Yeah, you can see it in the TimeformUS chart. Raging Sea came in as slightly faster than Scylla, a couple points. And not only that, she was proven around 2 turns, unlike Scylla. So it seemed a little bit silly to take that really short price. But regardless, I mean, I think Raging Sea showed she was much the best. Maybe some of that was the distance. She ran a 1:19 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, but I was really impressed with what I saw from her. She's still just a 4-year-old filly, fairly well raced. I mean, this was a race start, so it's not like she's hasn't been tried before, but she just seems to keep getting better and better. And she'll appreciate more distance as well, I would think. So the future is very bright for this Chad Brown trainee.
Yeah, she broke really sharply from her inside post position, and she's not a front runner, but when you have a horse that's coming from off the pace, you still want to see them break sharp because it gives the rider options, and he was able to get her into a good spot stalking along the inside, actually one spot ahead of Scylla, and he was just able to get the jump on that foe every step of the way. I guess the other slight disappointment in this race was the number 4 Loved, who was leading through the early stages. She was a filly who had attracted a lot of hype through the middle portion of last year. She had won a couple of races against overmatched foes by large margins in Kentucky. I think she was one of those horses that posted a blowout front-running victory at Ellis Park last summer. There were a lot of those. She disappointed in the Molly Pitcher, came back here, and I think again proved that maybe some of that form that she showed last year was dictated by the competition and not so much her being a horse that had as much upside as maybe some people thought she did.
Yeah, she faced some pressure from Hidden Connection, who actually ran quite well in this spot. She's kind of an up and down horse who you never really know what you're going to get from her, but she ran fine here. Loved was definitely disappointing not being able to get things her own way.
Yeah, and you're going to see Raging Sea take over at the top of the stretch here. Scylla tries to make a move between horses, but she's going to flatten out a little bit at the end. And I guess the question I have coming out of this race, Craig, is where does this really place Raging Sea? She's this newly turned 4-year-old, just won this grade 3 coming off the layoff with a 119 TimeformUS speed figure. You know, we've got a horse like Adair Manor out there who just won the Apple Blossom so impressively. Idiomatic is supposed to be coming back for yet another season, so I guess she still has to be considered the leader of this division, but is it conceivable that a horse like Raging Sea could thrust herself into that mix at the grade 1 level?
Sure it is. Particularly, I mean, this was just a mile and a 16th. She's proven at longer distances and may even prefer them. And it's not like her speed figures are that far off at Dare Manor and Idiomatic, what we saw from her last year. So just, I would expect her to keep moving forward. She's by Curlin, who obviously his horses usually get better with age. So this is one I'm really looking forward to seeing. And I think she's going to be a major force in the distaff division.
Well, we're going to stay with Friday's card at Keeneland for a little bit because I think there are several races on this undercard to discuss. One of those was the race that took place just after the Double Dog Dare. That was an allowance event on the turf going a mile that was won by the Cherie DeVoe trainee Northern Invader. And this horse can be a bit of a tease sometimes, Craig, because he'll face allowance company or slightly lesser competition and just look like this monster, as he did in this replay we're going to take a look at from Keeneland on Friday, where he breaks from the outside post position, is able to get to the front from out there, and just bosses this field around. He has been a short price on a number of occasions against Stakes Company and hasn't really gotten it done, aside from, I think, one win in a graded stakes race last summer. Overall, he's been a bit of a disappointment, but he earned another big speed figure here.
When he shows up, he runs big numbers. I remember when he broke his maiden with a huge figure, we actually downgraded it because of pace that day. He backed it up a couple races later in the Gio Ponte when he had won with a big number as a 3-year-old, as we saw from a lot of 3-year-old turf horses. But he wasn't able to get the job done at the end of the fairgrounds season, not the end of the season, but the end of the year last year when he was beaten by Gigante, a horse who's in really good form. Was really disappointing last time at 3-5, with definitely some issues in that race and some excuses, but he showed up here with a really big number. I think it's 123. So big effort, and if he can reproduce that when he steps up in company, he'll certainly be competitive. But as you note, that has been a question in the past.
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of big speed figures from this Keeneland turf course so far during this meet. Maybe it's not a huge surprise because you generally have some of the best runners in the country competing at this meet, but even at the maiden and allowance level, and we're going to talk about some non-stakes events from this Friday card that got big speed figures. This number does seem fast for some of the other horses in this race, but I mean, it's in line with what Northern Invader has been able to produce in the past, and you can see coming through the stretch, he is this big chestnut horse with that white blaze who just kind of looks like he towers over the competition from a physical stature as well as from his natural ability. Switching over to his left lead there as he runs on through the wire. He's a really good horse. I still am a little skeptical of whether he's going to be able to take this form to the graded stakes level in future starts, but this was a nice performance from him. And we're going to stick with Cherie DeVoe trainees as we move on to the 8th race, the race that went right before the Double Dog Dare, actually going the same mile and a 16th distance as that stakes race that we just talked about. And a couple of newly turned 4-year-olds returning from layoffs here, Cagliostro and Dreamlike, who put on a good show to the wire.
Yeah, this was quite the effort, and another one where we got a big speed figure. I think we had last seen Cagliostro in the Oklahoma Derby, if I remember right. Didn't really run very well that day. He was kind of a fringe player as a 3-year-old. Didn't run, didn't really get the job done, but was pretty competitive in all of his races. He was a good second in the Smarty Jones, third in the Indiana Derby, but he seemed to really put it together here, jumping to a career best Timeform US speed figure of a 123. This was a pretty easy day to make speed figures for. So it seems like it was just a fast race, and the runner-up Dreamlike, not really a surprise. He had shown lots of talent as a 3-year-old as well. So definitely some 4-year-olds adding to that older horse division that I would think we're going to see in stakes pretty soon.
Yeah, Dreamlike had made his prior start in the Breeders' Cup Classic, and obviously not a major factor that day, but coming out of that race, making this 4-year-old debut, he was bet down to 3-5, and maybe mildly disappoints not getting the job done, but as you just summed up, Cagliostro had shown real talent last year, and he obviously had the ability to move forward, beginning his 4-year-old campaign here. You could see in this replay, these two draw well clear of the field coming through the stretch, and Dreamlike is trying to run after Cagliostro, and top of the stretch, it looks like he might be able to get to him, but Cagliostro has enough left in the tank to hold him off coming to the early finish line with that short stretch run going the mile and the 16th distance at Keeneland. And both of these horses have the ability to potentially step forward going back into stakes company in this older horse division. Kind of funny that this was an N1X allowance race. You would think horses that have competed in stakes as much as these two have wouldn't be eligible for a first level allowance race, but they just hadn't done much running. You might remember Dreamlike actually was placed in the Wood Memorial as a maiden last year, so it took him a little while to actually get that maiden diploma, in Cagliostro just placing in so many stakes since breaking his maiden at Fairgrounds last year. But they're two really nice horses, and I'll be interested to see where they go next, likely into Graded Stakes Company. Well, Craig, let's discuss some of those other events from Thursday and Friday that achieved fast speed figures on the turf. One of them was the second race on this Friday card at Keeneland, a 5.5 furlong event. And actually, both of these races we're going to talk about to finish up Keeneland are 5.5 furlong maiden special weight races on the turf. And this one for the males, won by Monsieur Candy, a 3-year-old, and that's one of the reasons we're talking about this speed figure, because he is a 3-year-old earning a 116 Timeform US speed figure, breaking his maiden. I don't know exactly where these performances came from, but when compared them to the other turf races this day, it's hard to argue with these races getting big numbers.
Yeah, this was one I had trouble with, giving this horse this high a number. It just seemed like it was out of the blue, but there were 4 turf races on the day, 2 sprints, 2 routes. All 4 of them basically lined up perfectly to my projections. The variant within a point of each other. It was as conservative as I could be, and it just seems like this horse ran a very fast race. And when you watch it, there's not really a lot of argument with it. I mean, the horse just gets out on top, and he's there all the way, looks good. And just another one of these, we've talked about a lot of Louisiana breds lately, and this is yet another one who just seems to have tons of speed.
Yeah, there was an allowance race later on this card that we're not going to focus on, but going the same 5.5 furlong distance on the turf, won by Oceanic, who is a proven stakes horse, and very similar final time, just a tick faster, similar fractions throughout to this maiden race. So it does seem like a legitimate number, since you have that comparison to some older stakes horses that Monsieur Coco went, or I should say Monsieur Candy went nearly as fast as. And this horse just busted out of the gate, quickly opened up on the field, and you can see coming to the top of the stretch, allowed some rivals to get within range of him, but then he kicks on again to win this race impressively, pulling away. And when you have a fast speed figure like this, something you want to check for is that there are big gaps behind these horses, so that not everybody is getting a gigantic speed figure, and that's the case in this race. I mean, a gap back to the runner-up and then a bigger gap to the rest of the field. So it kind of does check out. This was just the second turf start for Monsieur Candy, so maybe he is just a very talented turf sprinter. And then another race along the same lines that we're going to talk about as the female counterpart to this race took place just the day prior, the 9th race on Thursday at Keeneland, and an even bigger upset going 5.5 furlongs on the turf. The 3-year-old filly, Nikki Nine Doors, coming off a couple of uninspiring races at Turfway, if I'm being kind. I mean, just hadn't really shown much in her prior 2 starts, but it kind of illustrates the difference between synthetic and turf, as this filly got on turf for the first time and was just a completely different horse, dominating what looked like a promising field on paper.
Yeah, dominating might be using the term lightly. I mean, she just crushed this field. And another one, not sure exactly where this one came from, but it's another card where there was another sprint race for older allowance horses, and they were rated together. They lined up perfectly. So I don't really have a lot of argument with the speed figure. Maybe she just liked the turf a whole bunch more than she did the synthetic. It certainly looked like that as we watched the race. This just looked like a canter around the track. She was never really in danger at any point.
Yeah, and the weird thing is she was not a horse who had shown speed in her prior 2 races on the synthetic at Turfway, but breaking from an outside post here, didn't have the gate speed of Monsieur Candy in the race we just looked at, but maybe half a furlong into this race, she went clear, continued to open up, and you're going to see at the top of the stretch here, once her rider asks her to go, she puts distance on this field, opens up a margin that is obviously insurmountable to her competition. I will say, if you're going to watch back this replay after we talk about it, you might want to focus on the runner-up in this race. I think it was the number 5, La Salvadoreña. She was a first-time starter for Ray Handel, and she's off the screen right now, but you're going to see her run into a clear second in this race. She broke a bit slowly, had some minor traffic trouble. She's actually a horse I might do on my Horses to Watch show that I'm going to put out on the DRF YouTube channel a little bit later this week, but maybe one that you want to look for, because this was a very fast race for the level, and I'm not exactly sure what to expect from the winner in subsequent starts, because this was such a surprise going off at the price that she did, paying $52 to win. But hard to argue with this race getting a fast number.
No, as I said, the 7th race to run just before I got basically the same speed figure, and that was for much more accomplished older fillies and mares.
Well, let's move over to New York. And as I said towards the top of the show, it was the beginning of turf season in New York. The first day of turf racing was their Saturday card, and the feature race that day was the Danger's Hour, this one going the mile distance on the turf for older horses. And, Craig, I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but I mean, sometimes you make a morning line and you're just fairly confident in it and you don't really expect to see any surprises when the wagering actually opens. And for me, this was one of those races I just kind of felt like I had a pretty good handle on this line. And I've got to say, I was not, well, I thought Equitize would take some money for Chad Brown as sort of the up-and-coming, exciting new face in the field. I was pretty surprised that he ended up going off the 3-2 favorite over a proven stakes horse like Spirit of St. Louis, who had run a number of speed flickers that just made him the obvious horse to beat in this race.
Yeah, and it turned out he was the horse to beat, as Equitize couldn't do it. That one did take a big jump forward, as a lot of people suspected, but just not big enough to match a horse like Spirit of St. Louis, who had run a 124 winning last time, just consistently had run 120 type TimeformUS speed figures, and got a big 125 for this one in his first start as a 5-year-old. So I think this horse is pretty good, and Equitize ran fine, but it's not like this was a nail biter at the end. I think Spirit of St. Louis was clearly best.
Yeah, I wanted to show the start of this race because I know there was some hate being thrown towards Javier Castellano for the ride on Equitize. Obviously, a lot of people bet this horse. They would have had to for him to go off at 3-2. And I think it was a little surprising that he was last in the early stages. But you could see, as the number 5, he breaks a half length slowly. Others want to be forward. And to my eye, Javier had no opportunity to ever get this horse out of last place in the early stages. The field obviously angles right over towards the inside, heading into that clubhouse turn. And unless he makes some ill-advised move around horses into the clubhouse turn going wide, which typically doesn't work out in these two-turn turf races, he just had no choice but to rate this horse in last. The pace was honest. They're moving up front. I think there are a couple of red color-coded pace figures towards the later stages of this race. So it does kind of fall apart at the end. What makes the winner of this race, Spirit of St. Louis, so dangerous, though, Craig, is he has versatility. We've seen him race up close to the pace, but like we saw here, he's just as comfortable coming from further back in the pack. You might remember his turf debut from the Belmont Stakes undercard last year, where he made this huge late run from, I think, 10th in the early going to win that race, going away by open lengths. So when you've got a horse like this that has turf ability and finishing speed that can sit right up on the pace or come from 5 or 6 lengths off the pace, it just makes that horse really tough to beat.
Yeah, he's really good. I was going to say what you did about Equitize. I don't know that being last was really a negative in this race. We had three horses going out, just going really fast, including Mason for Chad Brown was one of the three, a couple of other long shots. And all those horses finished towards the back of the pack. So I don't really give him much of an excuse here. And I'm not knocking him. He ran fine. I just don't think he was the best horse. I think it was Spirit of St. Louis.
Yeah, my take on Equitize is that he's a horse that's going to want to go a lot longer than a mile in the future. And Chad Brown, he's put out some quotes kind of alluding to that. He's obviously well aware of what his horses might ultimately want to do. And you could see Equitize actually galloping out ahead of Spirit of St. Louis after the wire. So we look at the tail end of that replay. He has a ton of stamina on the bottom side of his pedigree. Equitize I'm talking about. He's by Kingman, but his dam is actually a 3/4 sister to Arc de Triomphe Waldgeist. So, I mean, he is bred to go more like 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles. And this was just the fourth start of his career. I'm sure they don't want to stretch him out to a marathon distance right away, but I think we're going to see this horse go longer in the future. Spirit of St. Louis, Craig, he's a New York bred. This was just the first open company race of his career, but he's running to the kind of speed figures that say he might be the kind of horse that belongs in graded stakes company very soon.
Yeah, maybe that had something to do with the odds being a little bit surprising that he was just trying open company. But as a speed figure guy, it caught me by surprise.
Well, let's take a look at the female counterpart of this race, which was run on Sunday. That was the Plenty of Grace. And this one, I think the speed figure is not showing up on the TimeformUS chart yet, but we can show the replay anyway. Craig, not too competitive on paper. 6 horses were entered for turf. Unfortunately, 2 of them scratched. So just sort of an uncompetitive 4-horse field. And it got even more uncompetitive at the start when we take a look at this because the number 2, Sunset Louise, a dirt horse trying turf for the first time, looked like she was supposed to be the speed of this race. She broke a half step slowly. Kendrick Carmouche sort of decided to not be aggressive and rate her going into that clubhouse turn, and it just allowed Spirit and Glory to get to the front end. And from here, the race is basically over.
Yeah, this is one of those races I have a little more concerns. It is going to show up as a 120 TimeformUS speed figure, but it was the only turf race on this inner turf course on Sunday. The pace was pretty slow early. There were only 4 horses, so I would treat this race with a grain of salt. I'm not quite sure she's as good as the numbers indicates.
I would agree with that. She's a horse that we've talked about previously on the TimeformUS Forecast and Pacecast, having handicapped fairgrounds earlier this winter. She was very advantageous, taking advantage of the trip when I think it was the Alstall Memorial that she won 2 starts back. Didn't run quite as well as her next start at fairgrounds. And I guess she gets back to form here, Craig, but I think one of the bigger stories in this race was just some of the no-shows. I mean, Marvelous Maud had made 1 start in a year, clearly didn't come back to form as a 6-year-old. Midnight Mile, just making her first start at the Chad Brown barn, didn't really do anything special. So I'm not really sure what Spirit and Glory was beating, and she obviously did so with a trip that just couldn't have been any more advantageous to her. Let's finish up Aqueduct by talking about one more race from their Saturday card as I go back to April 20th. And it was the 7th race run right before that Dangerous Hour. And the winner of this one, Craig, is a name that's familiar from last year, Blazing Sevens. He was the runner-up in the 2023 Preakness. Now, the Preakness was clearly the weakest of the 3 Triple Crown races last year. I don't think there's any debating that. But Blazing Sevens, I mean, he was a Grade 1 winner as a 2-year-old. He has shown ability on occasion, coming back off the layoff here since last summer, making his 4-year-old debut. He got the job done, but did so in workmanlike fashion.
Yeah, it was fine. And I mean, yes, the Preakness was pretty weak, but it's not like the horse who narrowly beat him that day, and National Treasure hasn't been very good, obviously winning the Pegasus since. So I thought it was a promising return. I wouldn't have expected him to be fully cranked up for this, and he didn't need to be. He ran, I believe it's a 117 TimeformUS speed figure, 116 for the effort here, just the 1-turn mile. He's probably going to be fine with more distance, as we saw in the Preakness. And whatever went wrong last year seems like it's been fixed. And when he shows up again, I would expect a better number from him.
Yeah, he's a horse that has the potential to step forward in the future. I wonder what distance is ultimately going to be best for him, because he won the Champagne going a mile as a 2-year-old, obviously got the mile and 3/16 in the Preakness, but you might remember that was a race that didn't have a whole lot of pace on, so he did kind of get the right trip and then sprinting through the late stages in a race that maybe wasn't the true test of stamina you would expect a Triple Crown event to be. This race coming back going a mile, I wonder if he's a horse that really does want to go 2 turns, or if 1 turn is really best for him. And this was just a race that he needed coming off the layoff. It's not exactly clear just yet. As far as his the other Chad Brown trainee in the race, Artorias, who went off as the second choice, I mean, we just haven't seen much of this horse in the past couple of seasons. He showed talent as a 3-year-old in the summer at Saratoga, but just made a couple of starts last year, didn't win either of them, came off a long layoff again here. I just wonder if he's a horse that kind of missed his window of opportunity.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. He's never really taken a step forward from what we saw from him earlier in his career. And, he ran basically the same number this time as a 5-year-old. So until this horse really takes a step forward, he seems to be one that's just going to be a lot more popular at the windows than he is in the winner's circle.
Now, as we move on to Santa Anita, Craig, I know that you said you just uploaded these speed figures, so they're not going to show up in the TimeformUS charts that we're taking a look at just yet, but we can still show the replay and talk about this race. And the feature race on Saturday was the Grade 3 Californian. This one featured a heavy favorite in the number 2, Judge Miller, bet down to 1-5, facing 3 rivals off that big speed figure that I think we talked about on the Pacecast back in February when he got a 126, winning an allowance race by 11 lengths. And we mentioned at the time that the margin of victory was more due to the competition than anything else, because he wasn't facing the strongest field, but clearly ran a fast race and the public went with it, and him being that kind of graded stakes number horse in this Californian. And he unfortunately couldn't seal the deal against tougher company.
No, the longer distance maybe and the tougher company did him in here. Decent enough effort from him, but if you can't beat Mr. Fisk, and no knocks on Mr. Fisk, he's fine, but this was a grade 3 horse and a grade 3 race, and I think he's probably a grade 3 racehorse. We had seen him win the grade 3 Native Diver. He runs speed figures right around the 120 mark on his best day, and that's what we saw here. He got a 121. So if Judge Miller was really going to be a top horse, he should have been able to handle this one. Maybe it was the distance. Maybe he'll be better at shorter distances. He ran okay, but he really had no excuse to give it up late.
And right here, this part of the replay is, I think, the decisive moment by Kazushi Kimura, who is riding Mr. Fisk. When you're on a horse that lacks finishing a turn of foot like Mr. Fisk does, he's just a grinder, you want to get his run started early and potentially break the heart of a horse like Judge Miller, and that's what he did. He took the lead away from that rival before the quarter pole, and Judge Miller in his first mile-and-a-half test just could not respond, and Mr. Fisk was able to sustain that bid, given the stamina that we know he possesses on through the finish line, and won this race fairly decisively in the end. I do wonder if Judge Miller, Craig, is going to be a horse that ultimately does prefer going a little bit shorter. I know he's by Curlin. He's the full brother to Clairiere, but I always viewed Clairiere as a horse that was really at her best as a closing miler who could kind of get a mile in the 16th. But I mean, she went, I think, 1 for 10 in her career beyond a mile in the 16th. I think added distance didn't necessarily work for her, even though she had the running style to maybe get those longer distances. And maybe Judge Miller just turns out to be more of that 7 furlong to a mile specialist.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Breeding is great. It can be predictive at times, but what your eyes see on the racetrack when they try something don't usually lie. And this didn't look like a horse who appreciated the 1.1 miles.
Well, we'll finish up this podcast by discussing a couple of races from that stakes-laden card at Laurel from Saturday. Let's start with the 9th race on their Saturday card. This one was the Henry S. Clark, won by Dataman, as Graham Motion just dominated this one. He sent out the top 2 finishers. Both went off at 5-1 odds, and they were able to defeat the odds-on favorite Forever Super in here. But I do think this is a race that I should pull up the replay for, Craig, especially showing the stretch drive, because maybe not the ideal go of it through the lane for Forever Super.
No, to say the least. Sorry, we almost lost my voice there for a minute. Yeah, but Data Man's fine. I was interested in him in this race as a newly turned 4-year-old, something I like on turf, and he certainly ran well. He's going to get a big speed figure for this, a 121 TimeformUS. But Forever Super is a horse we've talked about a few times on our Pacecast recently. He's ran some nice races in Florida, and I think he did take that form north when he went to Maryland, but the trip was obviously less than ideal.
Yeah, just kind of boxed in at the top of the stretch. Would he have won this race if he had been out in the clear? It's hard to say. He obviously would have at least been second and beaten the runner-up English B. Data Man got the jump on him, was able to sustain that speed through the wire. I mean, I think the interesting thing about Data Man is that he won going a mile, because last year, as a 3-year-old, he looked like a horse and was campaigned like a horse that would eventually want marathon distances. So interesting that Graham Motion brought him back in this 1-mile race, and the fact that he was able to win, getting a TimeformUS speed figure as high as 121 is a really good sign for his future. So we'll be interested to see where he goes next. And I agree, Craig, I wouldn't get too down on Forever Super in this race, but I also wouldn't want to upgrade him too much, because he did have a very good trip until sort of getting in that box and upper stretch and just couldn't even quite get up for second. So for me, the jury's still out on a horse like that. And then we'll finish up the podcast with one more race from Laurel. The Federico Tessio, going the 1.1 mile distance, was race 10 on this card. 3-year-olds potentially prepping for the Preakness Stakes. This has been the traditional Maryland prep for the Preakness, so I think it remains to be seen whether any of these horses will ultimately end up in the starting gate for that second jewel of the Triple Crown. But this is a replay I want to get started, Craig, because I think it's worth showing the whole race, because Copper Tax, he only gets the job done by 3/4 of a length, but he was much more the best than that when you watch the trip.
Now, this is actually the one race I haven't seen, so I'm going to be watching it as we talk about it. The speed figure certainly wasn't all that exciting. This is another one I just uploaded, so it's not in the chart yet, but it's going to be a 108 for him, or maybe it is in the chart. I don't remember, but it's going to be a 108. So I'll let you talk about the trip as we watch. As I said, I haven't quite seen this one yet, and I didn't do this speed figure personally.
Yeah, I mean, I could actually just rewind the tape to the start for a second. I mean, he's the 11. You could see breaks, nose goes down to the dirt at the start of this race, stumbling badly. That's not what you want to see happen, especially breaking from post 10 at Laurel, where you head right into that clubhouse turn. And from here, you could see he still gets hung out 4 to 5 wide into the clubhouse turn as his jockey is trying to hustle him back up into the position that he wanted to be in originally. And you got a horse that's veering out in front of him. You could see the horse in the yellow silks and the red cap. He's sort of giving his rider all sorts of trouble, pushing Copper Tax even further out into the center of the course. His main rival is just getting a perfect trip on the front end, speediness, setting his own pace, and Copper Tax basically has to be hustled along for almost this entire race, just keeps making up ground. And I'm going to fast forward until about the top of the stretch. And you can see he's advanced all the way up into a joint second here. It still looks like speediness on the front end has plenty left in the tank, and he's going to take that advantage of about 3 lengths into upper stretch. But Copper Tax, Craig, the one thing that we know about him is he loves to win races. He's extremely game, and he just refuses to let this rival get away from him in the final 1/8 mile.
Yeah, this is pretty impressive as I watch it here. He's a horse who's now won 7 out of 10 starts lifetime. I mean, I wouldn't get too excited about a horse like this running if he does show up in a race like the Preakness. Maybe he will, because he's just never run fast enough to be competitive with those types. And we've seen it. The 2 really bad losses in his career were when he ventured out of town, tried to Remsen, tried to Davis, and things just didn't go well. Now, he probably had some excuses in those races, but I would still like to see him run a bit faster in his good efforts. But certainly a game racehorse, and one that when he faces his own level, he's very tough to beat, because he has a nose for that wire.
Yeah, his 108 TimeformUS speed figure, not going to cut it in a race like the Preakness, but I still thought this was an impressive performance from just a really likable horse that's easy to root for. And his trainer, Gary Capuano, has already kind of said that the Preakness is a bit of a reach, and they're not even sure that they're going to go in that direction, because he feels like he just might be a horse that, as game as he is, from a natural ability standpoint, he could be a cut below that. So he's a fun horse to root for, and I'll be interested to see where he does wind up, even if he continues racing in some lower level events on the Maryland circuit. So that wraps up our TimeformUS Pacecast for this week. That's all the races on our rundown. I guess before we leave everybody, Craig, we should discuss some of the things we have planned on the podcast in the coming weeks. We'll obviously come back with TimeformUS forecast later in the week, still deciding what pick 5 sequence we want to talk about, whether it's one of those combo sequences like the cross country, because there's no one card that seems like they're putting out a great option this weekend. Gulfstream looks interesting, though I don't think either of us are the biggest fans of always doing Gulfstream on the podcast and the different surfaces they've got going, but it does look like a good card. So we'll see what we ultimately decide to do for the forecast, but we'll try to make the best decision there. But I really wanted to mention next week for the Kentucky Derby, in the past, Craig, we've done a deep dive into the Kentucky Derby field, spending an ample amount of time discussing each of the 20 runners or 20 plus runners that could wind up in the Kentucky Derby starting gate, talking about the pace situation. And I think we're going to plan that early next week.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I wasn't sure what the plans were. Hopefully my voice will be better by Friday for the forecast. I think it's heading in that direction. I'm improving like Raging Sea is. So looking forward to that one. And yeah, I'm like any other racing fan. I don't get overly excited about the Derby until it's here. But once those PPs come out, and they're coming out a little earlier this year, I think the actual official PPs, I can't wait to talk about it, because I love the big races. It's one of those races you can make a life-changing score. I mean, it's just the fact we don't get very many of those, and we certainly don't get any like the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, and I'm going to be really interested to talk about this Kentucky Derby with you, Craig, because I don't think we've had too many conversations about how we think this 3-year-old class is coming together for the Kentucky Derby. I really have no idea where you might go in that race, and I'm not even sure where I'm going to go at this point in time. I've got a lot still to figure out as far as my picks in the Kentucky Derby. So still much to be determined, but we're going to probably get that podcast out to you around Monday or Tuesday of next week, I think is what we're currently planning on. So we'll have a little more on that in the coming days. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube now. You can watch with video, looking at the TimeformUS charts and the replays like we did on this edition of the podcast. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up a little bit later this week.